The air on Stony Rise did not breathe, it suffocated. Clara Vance stood on the precipice of the jagged limestone ridge, her boots anchored in the loose, dusty shale, as a sudden violent gust of wind threatened to sweep her off the ledge. Clutched tightly in her raw, bleeding hands was a massive, decaying white oak log, easily weighing 80 pounds, vibrating with a deep, furious resonance. Inside this hollow wood was a displaced colony of thousands of wild, feral honeybees, their angry, high-pitched buzz vibrating straight through her chest. One misstep on the crumbling edge would send both Clara and the hive plunging 50 feet onto the jagged boulders below, shattering the colony and leaving her at the mercy of an enraged, venomous cloud. Her knuckles turned white, her breath shallow but steady as she stared down into the yawning gray ravine. To the people of Pine Ridge, Clara was a biological anomaly, a woman carved from the same stubborn clay as the Ozark Mountains. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, with broad, heavy shoulders and muscular arms that had spent a lifetime clearing timber and hauling well water. In a valley where women were expected to be delicate, quiet, and easily tucked away, Clara was an unavoidable presence. The local townspeople whispered behind their hands when she walked past, calling her the Ogre of Stony Rise. They mocked her heavy, deliberate gait, laughing that she was far too clumsy and imposing to ever tend a proper home or find a husband. When her father passed away, leaving her nothing but the barren, rock-strewn ridge, the town assumed she would quietly starve or beg for charity. But Clara did not beg. She retreated to the stony heights, preferring the honest cruelty of the wind to the venomous gossip of her neighbors. On a stifling Tuesday morning, Clara walked down into the valley to trade her meager harvest of wild blackberries for a sack of coarse cornmeal. The town square was uncharacteristically crowded. A dense ring of spectators gathered near the old wooden granary. Intrigued by the commotion, Clara approached the edge of the crowd, her towering height allowing her to see easily over the heads of the onlookers. At the center of the circle stood Silas Sterling, the valley's wealthiest merchant and a land speculator who measured human worth solely by the dollar. He was holding a long iron rod tipped with a smoldering yellow bundle of sulfur-soaked rags. Above him, tucked tightly under the eaves of the granary, was a massive gray wild beehive. The bees agitated by the heat, and the crowd boiled over the entrance of their nest in a frantic defensive mass. "Useless stinging pests," Sterling sneered to the crowd, raising the smoking torch. "They're a hazard to the workers and a nuisance to my business. We'll smoke 'em out, suffocate the queen, and burn the whole nest to ash." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. To them, the bees were nothing but danger, a minor inconvenience to be wiped out without a second thought. Clara stared at the frantic insects. She watched them tumble over one another, desperately trying to shield their queen and their honeycomb from the approaching poison. A deep ache bloomed in her chest. She saw herself in those bees, creatures judged solely by their defenses, hated simply because they possessed the means to sting back when pushed too far. They were being destroyed, not because they had done harm, but because their existence was inconvenient to a man who owned everything. "Stop!" Clara's voice, low and resonant, cut through the chatter of the crowd. The spectators fell silent, turning in surprise to look at the giant girl from Stony Rise. Silas Sterling paused, his torch hovering inches from the hive, his mouth curling into a condescending smirk. "Well, if it isn't Clara Vance," Sterling drawled, gesturing with the smoldering rod. "Come down from your rock to teach us how to run a town." "I'll take them," Clara said, stepping forward. Her voice did not waver, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I will take the hive. You don't need to kill them." Laughter erupted from the crowd. "You!" a local farmer shouted. "What's a clumsy thing like you going to do with a swarm of wild bees? Build 'em a house." "I have $5, Clara said, ignoring the jeers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her last silver coins, money meant to buy seed and winter supplies. She held them out, her hand steady despite the trembling in her knees. "I will pay you for the right to remove the log. If I fail, you can burn them tomorrow." Sterling looked at the silver, then at Clara's determined face. A cruel amusement flickered in his eyes. He knew $5 was all she had left. He snatched the coins from her palm. "You have until sunset, Clara. If you're not gone by then, I'll burn the log with you under it." Without a word, Clara borrowed a heavy crosscut saw from a sympathetic blacksmith. Under the mocking glares of the townspeople, she climbed the wooden scaffolding, her large frame straining as she carefully sawed through the dead oak beam housing the hive. The work was brutal, her muscles screaming under the weight, but she did not stop. When the timber finally groaned and parted, she caught the massive, heavy log in her bare arms. Now, standing on the edge of the Stony Rise ravine, the memory of their laughter faded beneath the heavy vibrating reality in her arms. The wind howled, trying to tear her balance away. Slowly, with agonizing precision, Clara shifted her weight, anchoring her heels into the clay. She took a deep breath, ignoring the sharp sting of a scout bee that had found its way to her neck. She did not flinch. She took one step forward, then another, moving away from the drop-off and toward the clearing she had prepared. She gently lowered the heavy hollow log onto a flat pedestal of limestone. As her hands released the wood, a thick golden cloud of bees erupted from the opening, swirling around her head in a dizzying musical storm. Clara stood perfectly still in the center of the swarm. She did not strike at them, nor did she run. She closed her eyes, listening to the low, magnificent hum of their collective survival. In the valley below, the people of Pine Ridge believed she had carried home her own doom. But as Clara looked at the resilient little creatures beginning to orient themselves to their new home, she knew this was not the end. It was a beginning. Deep in the valley, Silas Sterling was already drawing up plans to expand his holdings, unaware that the seeds of his undoing had just been carried up the mountain. And on the dusty trail leading to Stony Rise, a lone set of footprints was making its way toward Clara's ridge, destined to bring an unexpected ally to her wooden sanctuary. The autumn chill arrived early on Stony Rise, painting the surrounding oak forests in shades of rust and copper. But inside Clara's small, drafty cabin, the only sound was the rhythmic rasp of a hand plane shaving sweet-smelling pine. For months, Clara's life had shrunk to the boundaries of her clearing and the quiet needs of her rescued hive. She didn't possess the money to buy the standardized white-painted hives used by commercial apiarists in the eastern states, so she built her own. She salvaged discarded shipping crates, weathered barnwood, and scrap timber abandoned by the local sawmill. Her hands, already calloused from years of heavy farm labor, grew rougher, scarred by the bite of handsaws and the sharp, hot pricks of venom. In the beginning, the bees had treated her as an intruder. They were wild, defensive survivors of a harsh wilderness, and they guarded their new sanctuary with fierce desperation. Clara's arms and face had swollen with dozens of stings during those first few weeks, but she refused to wear the heavy, suffocating canvas veils that other farmers used. She wanted the bees to know her scent. She wanted to learn the exact limit of their patience. Slowly, an extraordinary transformation took place. As Clara learned to move with absolute deliberation, her massive frame gliding through the apiary with the quiet grace of a shifting shadow. The bees stopped attacking. Her body, once mocked by the townspeople as clumsy and heavy, developed a quiet, fluid precision. Her skin hardened, building a natural immunity to the venom until a sting became nothing more than a passing warmth. Clara split the original wild colony into 3 crude, homemade Langstroth boxes, placing them gently on flat stone pedestals facing the morning sun. She spent hours sitting quietly beside the entrances, watching the foragers return with their pollen baskets laden with the bright yellow dust of wild goldenrod and aster. She began to recognize the subtle changes in their collective voice. A high-pitched, frantic whine meant queenlessness or hunger, while a deep, resonant, peaceful drone signified a hive rich in honey and content with its queen. For the first time in her life, Clara felt a profound sense of belonging. She was no longer the awkward giantess of Pine Ridge. She was the silent guardian of a thriving miniature empire. It was during one of these golden late-afternoon observations that the quiet of Stony Rise was broken by the sound of snapping twigs and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of an animal. Clara stood up slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the wooden hive tool at her belt. Through the dense hazel brush at the edge of the clearing stepped a young red-robed Hereford calf, its ears twitching in distress. Close behind it came Ethan Hayes. He was a quiet man of 25 with broad, sunburned shoulders and eyes the color of the river after a spring rain. He was one of the few farmers in the valley who had never joined in the town's cruel mockery of Clara, though he had always kept his distance occupied by the grueling demands of his own struggling family farm on the valley floor. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching as he took in the scene before him. Clara was standing in the center of her apiary, completely unprotected. A swirling, shimmering halo of thousands of honeybees danced in the golden sunbeams around her head. One particularly large hive frame rested in her bare, dirt-smudged hands, completely blanketed by a crawling, vibrating mass of golden-brown insects. She looked like a pagan goddess carved from the mountain itself, entirely at peace amidst a storm of potential pain. I'm sorry to intrude, Clara. Ethan spoke softly, keeping his voice low so as not to startle the swarm. My sister's calf broke through the bottom pasture fence. I've been tracking her up the ridge for an hour. Clara did not turn her head quickly. She kept her eyes on the frame, gently nudging a cluster of bees aside with her thumb to inspect the capped brood cells beneath. She's safe here, Clara replied, her voice a low, soothing murmur that seemed to calm the insects as much as the man. The bees won't bother her unless she steps on a hive entrance. Ethan took a hesitant step closer, his curiosity overriding his caution. He looked at the crude hand-built wooden boxes, then at Clara's calm, unmasked face. They say in town that you're keeping a swarm of demons up here. Silas Sterling tells everyone you're going to get someone killed. A faint, bitter smile touched Clara's lips. Silas Sterling only fears what he cannot own or control. These aren't demons, Ethan. They are families. They work, they protect their young, and they only fight when someone tries to burn their home down. Ethan watched her hands. They were large, yes, but they moved with an exquisite, heartbreaking tenderness as she slid the heavy frame back into the box. He felt a sudden sharp ache of admiration for this woman. The town called her useless and clumsy, yet here she was coaxing sweetness out of a wild, stinging wilderness that would have sent any grown man in Pine Ridge running for cover. I can see that, Ethan said quietly, stepping up to stand beside her. He looked down into the open hive, watching the bees ripple like liquid gold over the wooden frames. It's beautiful, Clara, truly. That afternoon marked the beginning of a quiet alliance. Ethan did not leave immediately after securing the calf. He stayed to help Clara haul a heavy pine log that had fallen across her northern fence line, his strength matching hers in a silent, comfortable rhythm. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to find excuses to climb the steep, rocky trail to Stony Rise. He brought her surplus timber from his family's old barn, and in return, Clara shared her knowledge of the mountain's wild flora. They spoke of the changing weather, the hardening clay, and the persistent, worrying dry spell that had kept the autumn rains from falling. By the time the final wild asters began to fade, Clara harvested her very first batch of honey. She crushed the dark combs by hand, straining the thick, heavy liquid through clean burlap into stoneware jars. It was unlike any honey sold in Sterling's general store. It was dark, rich, and tasted intensely of wild sage iron and the deep, resilient sweetness that could only be pulled from the rockiest soil. When she handed Ethan his first jar, their fingers brushed. His hand was warm, his grip lingering for just a second too long. "This is a miracle, Clara," he whispered, looking from the golden jar to her dark, intelligent eyes. "There's nothing like this down in the valley." But as they stood together on the ridge looking down at the parched, dusty fields of Pine Ridge, a warm, unnatural wind blew from the south. The air was dry, devoid of the moisture that the winter crops desperately needed. Clara felt a sudden cold knot of dread form in her stomach. Her bees were preparing to cluster for the coming winter. But the earth below them was parched, brittle, and silent, a sleeping giant waiting for a spark or a slow, devastating thirst that would test the limits of everyone in the valley. The winter that followed was not cold but dry and ghostly. By the time spring crawled across the Ozarks, it brought no rain. Only a relentless, parching sun that baked the clay of Pine Ridge into concrete. The creek beds cracked, resembling shattered gray pottery, and the water table dropped so low that the shallower wells in the valley ran dry by mid-May. In the fertile valley orchards, the apple and peach trees struggled to push out weak, brittle blossoms. But there was a deeper, more terrifying problem. The hot, static winds of the drought had desiccated the pollen, and the native wild insects had perished in the dry winter. Without pollination, the blossoms would wither and drop, leaving the branches barren and the farmers facing total financial ruin. Down in the valley, the atmosphere was thick with desperation. Silas Sterling capitalized on the panic, offering predatory loans to the struggling homesteaders, quietly positioning himself to foreclose on their ancestral lands when the autumn harvest inevitably failed. He told the frightened farmers that the drought was an act of God, a curse that no man could fight. Yet high above the dusty despair of the valley floor, Stony Rise was alive with a low, vibrant hum. While the shallow wells below failed, Clara's Ridge was blessed with a deep, ancient limestone spring that seeped slowly through the mountain's cracks. It was enough to keep a small hidden meadow of deep-rooted lavender, wild sage, and purple clover damp and blooming. Clara's 3 hives had grown into 12. Her bees did not suffer. Every morning as the sun began to bake the valley, massive shimmering clouds of golden-brown insects rose from stony rise. Guided by an instinct older than the drought, they did not stay on the mountain. They drifted down into the valley, fanning out across miles of parched farmland, seeking the desperate dry blossoms of the orchard trees. Ethan Hayes was the first to notice the miracle. He stood in his family's apple orchard, running a hand over a dusty branch, expecting to find the shriveled, unpollinated remains of the season's crop. Instead, he heard a sound that made his heart leap, a soft, steady, industrious buzzing. Looking up, he saw dozens of Clara's distinct dark-bodied feral honeybees working methodically through the white blossoms, their legs heavy with bright yellow pollen. Unlike the wild insects that had vanished, Clara's bees were backed by a clean water source and a tireless guardian. They were strong enough to brave the dry heat. Within weeks, Ethan's orchard began to set tiny, hard green fruits, their stems thick and healthy. The neighboring farms, situated just within the flight range of the Stony Rise hives, began to show the same impossible signs of life. Clover fields, revived vegetable gardens began to yield, and the heavy scent of ripening fruit began to drift through the dusty air of the eastern valley. The farmers who had once jeered at Clara now stood in their fields watching the tiny golden couriers fly back and forth from the high ridge. They began to realize that the useless pests and the ogre they had mocked were silently keeping the specter of starvation from their doors. But Silas Sterling noticed the golden clouds too, and to a man who traded in debt, Clara's miracle was a threat. If the valley farmers harvested a crop, they would not need his high-interest loans. They would not lose their land to his ledger. On a blistering July afternoon, Sterling rode his black stallion up the steep rocky trail to Stony Rise, accompanied by two of his hired hands and the local town marshal. Clara was in the apiary, her large frame cloaked in a light linen shirt, her hands bare, as she carefully inspected a honey super. Ethan, who had been helping her clear a dry brush pile to prevent fire hazards, stepped forward, his face hardening as the horses entered the clearing. "Can I help you, Mr. Sterling?" Clara asked, her voice calm and level, though she did not lower the frame she was holding. Sterling dismounted his boots, kicking up clouds of fine gray dust. He sneered at the neat rows of wooden hives, though his eyes lingered greedily on the heavy, honey-filled supers. "I'm here on official business, Clara," he said, pulling a folded legal document from his breast pocket. "The town council has passed an emergency ordinance regarding public safety during the drought. These wild insects of yours are a public hazard. They're swarming the valley, contaminating the limited water sources and posing a threat to the townspeople." "That's a lie, Silas, and you know it," Ethan snapped, stepping between Sterling and Clara. "Those bees are the only reason my family's orchard has fruit. They're pollinating every farm from here to the river." "The law is the law, Hayes," Sterling replied smoothly, ignoring the younger man. He turned his cold gaze back to Clara. "The ordinance states that all unregistered wild bee colonies within the municipal boundary must be destroyed to conserve water and protect the public. However, because I am a charitable man, I am willing to offer you a solution. Sell me Stony Rise, including the spring, for $50, and I will relocate these hives to my own private property outside the town limits." Clara looked at the document, then at the dry, withered valley visible beyond her ridge. She saw the trap clearly. Sterling did not want to destroy the bees. He wanted to own them. He wanted to control the only water source left on the mountain, and by seizing her land, he would ensure that the farmers below remained entirely at his mercy. "No," Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed the weight of the limestone beneath her feet. "The land is not for sale, and the bees will not be destroyed." Sterling's face darkened, the polite facade slipping to reveal the ruthless speculator beneath. "You think you can defy the town council, girl? You're a squatter on a pile of rocks. If you don't sign this easement by Tuesday, the marshal here will return with kerosene, and we will burn every single one of these boxes to the ground. Let's see how much your precious bugs can help you then." He spun on his heel and mounted his horse, riding away without another word, leaving a heavy, choking silence in the dry air. Ethan turned to Clara, his hands shaking with anger. "He'll do it, Clara. He owns the marshal and he owns the council. We can't fight them alone." Clara gently placed the hive frame back into its slot. Her movements still incredibly precise, though her eyes burned with a quiet, dangerous fire. She looked down at her hands, strong and scarred, and then at the thousands of golden bees returning to their hives, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. "We are not alone, Ethan," Clara said softly, her voice carrying a chilling certainty. The valley is waking up. They know what the bees have done for them. It is time we show them what Silas Sterling is truly trying to steal. The heat inside the Pine Ridge Town Hall was stifling, thick with the scent of dry timber sweat and simmering anxiety. Nearly every resident of the valley had squeezed into the wooden benches, their faces hollowed by months of unrelenting drought. At the front of the room stood Silas Sterling, looking immaculate despite the dust, his hands resting heavily on the cedar podium. Beside him, the town marshal stood with his arms crossed, a legal padlock and a tin of kerosene resting conspicuously on the table. Sterling cleared his throat, his voice projecting with the practiced authority of a man who believed he had already won. "Neighbors, we are facing an unprecedented crisis." Sterling began, his tone dripping with mock solemnity. "The drought has pushed us to the brink. And yet while we ration our water, a public hazard festers on Stony Rise. Clara Vance's wild, aggressive insects are draining our mountain's spring and swarming our properties. For the safety of our children and the preservation of our valley, the marshal will execute the council's order to dismantle her hives and secure that spring under municipal control this evening." A murmur of uneasy assent rippled through the front rows, men who owed Sterling money and did not dare cross him. But before the marshal could pick up the padlock, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall banged open. Clara Vance stepped into the room. She did not wear the tattered, dust-stained clothes of a hill farmer. She wore a clean, simple dress of indigo cotton, her broad shoulders held high and her dark hair pulled back from her strong, unyielding face. Behind her came Ethan Hayes, carrying a massive, heavy wooden crate that exuded a rich, intoxicating aroma of pine wax and wild summer blossom. "The marshal will do no such thing." Clara's voice rang out low and resonant, striking the timber rafters like a church bell. Sterling's eyes narrowed, a sneer twisting his mouth. "You are out of order, Clara. This is a legal proceeding. You cannot stop the execution of a public safety ordinance." "I'm not here to stop it," Clara said, walking down the center aisle, her heavy, deliberate footsteps silencing the whispers of the crowd. "I'm here to show the people of Pine Ridge what you are actually trying to destroy." She signaled to Ethan, who set the crate down on the heavy oak table before the judge's bench. With a smooth, practiced motion, Clara lifted the lid. The sweet, heavy scent of wildflower honey erupted into the stifling room, so potent it made the parched onlookers gasp. Inside the crate were rows of gleaming glass jars, filled with thick, dark amber honey, flanked by baskets of plump, heavy green apples, late-season peaches, and robust garden squash, all harvested from the dry valley floor. "Silas Sterling wants you to believe my bees are a plague," Clara said, turning to face the crowd. Her eyes swept over the neighbors, who had mocked her size, her clumsy gait, and her quiet life for years. "But look at this fruit. Look at Ethan's harvest. Look at the orchards of the eastern ridge. While your wells ran dry, my bees flew miles down this valley. They carried life on their wings. They pollinated your crops, saved your orchards, and kept your families from starving while the rain refused to fall." "A few apples do not change the law," Sterling shouted, his face reddening as he slammed his fist onto the podium. "Those bees are a danger, and that spring belongs to the town." "Does it?" Ethan Hayes stepped forward, pulling a crumpled, leather-bound ledger from his coat pocket. He held it up for the entire room to see. "This is Sterling's private registry found in his office at the granary. It shows he has already drafted foreclosure papers for 12 farms in this valley farms. He expected to fail because of the drought. He wanted to burn Clara's hives because he knew her bees were saving our crops. If our crops survived, we could pay our taxes and keep our land. He wanted the spring on Stony Rise to control the water supply, forcing us to buy from him or starve." The room erupted into a deafening roar of outrage. Farmers stood on their benches, shaking their fists at the podium. The very men who had whispered jokes about Clara's large frame now looked at her with a mixture of awe and deep, burning shame. They realized that the woman they had cast out as useless was the only shield that had stood between them and ruin. The town marshal looked at the furious faces of his neighbors, then at the incriminating ledger in Ethan's hand. Slowly he stepped away from Sterling, leaving the padlock and the kerosene on the table. Realizing the tide had turned, Sterling attempted to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the jeers of the community he had tried to exploit. Defeated and exposed, he gathered his papers and slunk out the side door into the blistering afternoon heat, his power over Pine Ridge shattered forever. 2 years later, the rains had returned, washing away the dust and leaving the valley of Pine Ridge green, fertile, and prosperous once more. High on Stony Rise, the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across a clearing that was no longer barren. Clara's small cabin had been expanded, its cedar shingles weathered to a soft silver gray. 30 white-painted hives stood in neat, orderly rows, surrounded by vast, vibrant fields of purple lavender and wild clover. The low, peaceful hum of the apiary was a constant, comforting music that drifted down into the valley below. Clara stood at the edge of the ridge, her large, strong hands resting gently on her hips. Her frame was still imposing, but she no longer carried the weight of the town's mockery. She was a master apiarist now, her honey highly sought after across the state, and her advice valued by every farmer in the county. A pair of warm, calloused hands slid gently around her waist from behind. Clara leaned back into Ethan's chest, a deep, contented sigh escaping her lips. The boys from the valley just loaded the last shipment of clover honey onto the wagon. Ethan whispered, his breath warm against her ear. They asked if you'd have more ready before the autumn frost. Clara smiled, turning in his embrace to look into his eyes. The bees are already working on it. They never truly rest. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, delicate object. It was not a gold ring from Sterling's old store, but a beautiful, intricate band of silver, hand-carved in the shape of a honeycomb, holding a tiny, polished piece of raw, amber-colored river stone. He slipped it onto her finger where it fit perfectly against her strong, scarred hand. "They called you useless, Clara?" Ethan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But you saved us all. You brought the sweetness back to this valley." Clara looked down at the ring, then out over the buzzing golden sanctuary of Stony Rise. The wind no longer suffocated. It carried the scent of life growth and a future they had built together from the hardest stone.